Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. We're going to get started. So thank you all for joining us, and welcome to this event, which is part of the Retrofit 25 event series. This topic is going to be on money. So we're going to be talking about all the ways that we might fund and finance retrofit projects. We've got a really great panel of expert speakers, and I'd really encourage you to think about questions along the way. We've got people here that can really provide you advice and guidance on every type of retrofit project, no matter what the tenure, no matter what the scale, no matter what route for funding or finance you're thinking about. So please do think about questions. There'll be time for questions towards the end. We'd like to make this as useful to all of you as possible. So we're going to explore a little bit to start with innovative financial models and economic opportunities for retrofit that can drive this national change that we're trying to look for. We want to look at how we can align retrofit solutions with community needs and investor goals and make sustainable building upgrades both accessible and transformative. I'm joined today by Jude from the Green Finance Institute, Natalie Gardner from Turner and Townsend, Stuart Hallett from Arup, and Ben Cross from Moore. I'm going to hand over to each of them to tell us in a short few minutes a bit about what their role is in the retrofit sector, how they're interfacing with finance and where their interest lies. And then I've got lots of questions, and I'm sure you do too, so we'll get straight onto that. So over to you, Ryan.
Great, thanks Rachel, and thanks everyone for coming this evening. I'm actually here with a couple of hats on, but I'll talk to my Green Finance Institute one first. So for those who aren't aware, the Green Finance Institute is a non-profit organisation that was set up by the government, the City of London Corporation, 6 years ago now, with the remit to green the financial system, green the economy. It's all about how do we create the financial products to have the real economy outcome that we want in different sectors. So I run the Built Environment team, Programme Director there, and our mission there is to make sure that no matter what type of building you are, what type of tenure it is, that there is a financial solution, an appropriate financial solution available to you. And I'm always keen to stress here that we're not there yet, obviously, as many of you know. But that means that we've worked with banks over the years to scale some sorts of products like green mortgages. There used to be 4 in the market. Now there's almost 90. We've worked with them to develop those over the years. It also means working with the UK government on some of the areas where there are regulatory or policy blockers or policy uncertainty that is stopping innovation happening. That's included working very closely with the new government on the Warm Homes Plan and the manifesto pledge there to have low interest finance available. But it's also, on the other side, working at the bigger scale on the infrastructure, social housing, heat networks, working with institutional investors and developers to support that side as well. So there's a lot we do at GFI, which I'm sure will be relevant to many of you here. My other hat then is I'm also a councillor in Westminster, where I'm the cabinet member for climate, ecology, culture, libraries, public toilets, mortuaries, archives, registrars, parks, and a few more things which aren't as relevant, but they are all relevant to this discussion. Because when I'm thinking about what I need to do in Westminster, it's our net zero targets, and that involves those bits that aren't climate in my portfolio. So how do I retrofit my libraries? How do I retrofit our very good network of public toilets in Westminster? If you aren't aware of them, I can show you where they all are later. But I need to be making sure that we're getting all that to net zero. So I'm not just thinking about it with the GFI hat on and how do we do it, but I'm thinking about it on the ground, as many of you are here today. Thanks.
What an offer. Over to you, Natalie.
Hey, hi, is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Hi, so I'm Natalie Gardner. I'm a principal consultant in the Sustainable Communities team at Turner and Townsend. And I'm here with my hat on from RISE, which is the Retrofit Information, Support and Expertise Technical Assistance Facility that was set up by DESNZ, so the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And that really is a technical assistance facility that was built and designed in a way to build capacity within the sector, as well as awareness around retrofit, and create a feedback loop that could further inform policy going forward as well. So from my side of things, I'm talking more from a grant perspective. So that's around the challenge in accessing grant funding for appropriate projects, largely for social housing and housing providers, but broadly also for local authorities too, who can apply for the Warm Homes programme under local grant for local authorities, and for social housing, which is Warm Homes Social Housing Fund. There have been iterations of this that I'm sure you've heard before. There was a home upgrade grant, which was again for local authorities to work with their housing stock in the area that's not owned by them, but for low-income households. And then you also had, with the Social Housing Fund, we had the decarbonisation funds previously, a demonstrator wave 1 and 2.1 and 2.2 over the last years. So really, you know, the question about accessing financing, what we're really trying to tackle there with ours is through different work streams, we call them, within the technical assistance facility, because this is really not just a matter of write a bid, win some money, deliver a project. We know it's not that simple. So we look at the problem in several ways. We tackle it from working at an engagement and learning level. So we have a team dedicated to working with senior stakeholders, both in government, local authorities, and large housing providers who have potential to deliver at scale, and taking lessons learned from that to inform policy, as well as to raise awareness about how they can access better grant funding that suits their programs. We also have it from a kind of learning masterclass, podcast, and bootcamp series we offer to housing associations and local authorities, which I really enjoy doing myself because I tend to get to talk to people for a whole day around something I love, which is resident and stakeholder engagement. And so we're trying to tackle it from that kind of, not grassroots, but that very local organizational basis of building capacity. And we also work from a technical and supply chain side of things. So what I mean by that is we have a technical team who are retrofit technical experts who deal with anything from data and creating more accurate building data with you through to resident engagement plans, as well as procurement. And then we have a team that works specially with the supply chain to get that feedback loop from them to understand what their barriers are and blockers are to working with perhaps, let's say, smaller landlords, for example. And throughout the technical assistance facility, we're hoping that we're able to not just disseminate funding and make sure that that grant that's being delivered does actually get delivered into projects that end up delivering the performance outcomes that we're hoping in terms of carbon savings and energy efficiency and lower bills. But that we're also starting to notice the nuances and I think the barriers that not one size fits all. And that today, hopefully, we start talking a bit more about how we can be more strategically aligned with each other and not just rely on single grant projects, but larger programmatic thinking.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to continuing that. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you. Another test? Yeah, great. So Stuart Hallett, I'm associate at Arup, the Sustainable Development Consultants, just based around the corner, actually. I lead a team of people, and we call ourselves Urban Energy and Integrated Energy Systems. As the title might suggest, it's very focused on the sort of solutions where retrofit finds its natural home, the urban environment, and wider beyond that. But we really take a kind of system strategic macro look at the solutions that will get whole areas and regions to net zero and the part that retrofit plays in that. My particular interest, and I think the reason that Rachel has invited me to be on the panel is part of the work we're doing. It's really looking at the models for creating the environment for private sector investment into decarbonisation more widely, but retrofit very much as part of that. And the stress is on the emerging part of those models and those test cases. As Ryan says, that we don't have the answer yet, because if we did, we wouldn't be doing consultancy work, people would be doing it. But there are really interesting and exciting models coming forward. So happy to talk about that a bit more.
Thanks, Stuart. Over to you, Ben.
Great, thank you. So I'm Ben Cross, founder of a company called MORE, which there's a couple of acronyms kicking around in all of this. So MORE actually stands for Modern Office Real Estate, but really it's an attitude towards development rather than just being a development company. And we set up the business less than 2 years ago to really focus on what we saw as being the biggest opportunity of this generation, which is the decarbonisation of real estate, but doing that in a way that is both cost effective, smarter, less risk, and ultimately produces a return on investment. I spent most of my career on the consultancy side, working for architectural practices and actually working for developers. The latter half of my career, as well as doing some residential development outside of London, I spent trying to make retrofit attractive and desirable in the market and led a number of schemes for an organisation called General Projects, where we were basically retrofitting, I think, about 1.5 million square feet of quite complicated, undervalued assets, and saw this opportunity to really find a way of achieving a business model in a world that is getting hotter, where resources are scarcer, and where there's a lot more transparency required by everyone to do the right thing. So at More, we're effectively focusing our efforts on the elephant in the room, which is M&E and systems integration, and how that can work effectively through the repurposing of existing energy infrastructure to ultimately produce business plans that create a return on investment that the private sector can, well, adopt, use, deploy, or otherwise. We don't use grant funding. We're sort of trying to build a business model around getting around some of the more sort of typical restrictions that you have in real estate, be it planning, be it I suppose, increased premium specifications that come with, let's say, going through a process where you're ultimately adding floor space. You've got to meet future energy standards. You've got to do all like fantastic things, but ultimately, because those business plans take longer, they are harder, they have more risk, and they ultimately involve more capital. We're in a world where actually we're always having to produce extraordinary financial returns to make investors invest into those types of projects. So we've effectively set ourselves out to be very tactical, forensic, understand how buildings function, start with value engineering the systems from day one, and then ultimately building a progressive business plan around that. Because if we're going to, be it retrofit the 1.4 billion square feet of commercial floor space that doesn't meet minimum energy standards by 2030, or the 28 million homes that already exist, like, we're not going to do it by creating additional floor space and ripping everything out and starting again.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to sort of combining some of the different experiences that you will have and approaching this as a bit of a systems challenge, because I think lots of the learnings you have from the commercial sector can be sort of used within the domestic sector as well. I should probably say a little bit about myself. I'm Rachael Owens. I'm one of the co-directors of the National Retrofit Hub. We're a non-profit collaborative organisation. We try to bring together as many people who work in the retrofit sector as possible to collectively co-create solutions to some of the challenges to scaling up of retrofit. I'm by no means an expert in finance. My job is essentially to talk to lots of experts and try and understand how everything that they tell us links together. So yeah, I'll be posing some questions to these guys, but yeah, do think up questions yourself as we go along. I wanted to start a little bit with the sort of more grant-funded space, because obviously a large proportion of the retrofit work that has been done to date has been delivered through government grants. And I wondered, maybe, Natalie, if you wanted to talk a little bit about what opportunities still exist within the grant funding space before we maybe move on to more sort of privately financed options.
Yeah, sure. That sets us up quite well, doesn't it? So, like I said, we've had about, I think, was it almost 3 billion that's been made available over the last 7 years. And that's specifically for social housing and low-income households, disseminated from the department for tackling those most vulnerable. So we've had a concentrated effort over the last years to tackle homes that really were some of the worst that we have in the country in terms of them having external knock-on problems. So a home isn't just inefficient in energy, is it? It's also probably got damp and mold issues, which has a knock-on effect for health, which, if you want to talk about it in pure money terms, has a knock-on effect to having consistency in tenancy. But in a real human way, it means that we know that's additional costs into the NHS, and as well as trying to retain the household's mental health and ability to pay bills. So when we say we've got a lot of opportunities, we have done a lot of work already. The social housing sector is one of the best performing. The the English Housing Survey just recently published how much better housing in social housing is generally in terms of its energy efficiency compared to private sector. And I think that is to go to show that housing associations and local authorities have very much prioritised and upgraded their homes. But where does that leave us? I think what we do see with the grant-funded programs is there are those who fall within the gaps, and so there is an opportunity here. I see specifically with smaller landlords, so those with 1,000 or less properties, specifically those, especially those who are in rural areas who might be off gas, and they need a solution that will enable them to treat their properties, because these are the types of properties that often aren't as easy to deliver at scale. It might be one house that's down the road 15 miles away and another house that's another 15 miles away in two different archetypes. And so there is definitely some sort of piece we need to be creating around transparency of projects that are ongoing, so that we can, perhaps my sort of remit is around creating consortia to support each other to deliver joint procurement or one-stop shops where we could be picking up those smaller properties that will eventually start to fall behind in this world with funding.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a little bit about the potential for sort of area-based and place-based schemes to help with that a little bit later on. But yeah, fascinating. The English Housing Survey, I think it shows that about 4% of socially rented homes have a serious health hazard, and that's compared with 10% of privately rented homes. So they are going faster, and I think there's a lot we can learn from that sector. Oh, you're seeing my nice tree background there. That's relaxing for you all. I wondered as well, Natalie, just to follow on, you obviously support a lot of organisations who are accessing grant funding. Do you have any top tips for how to successfully deliver a grant-funded scheme and access finance in the first place?
Yeah, that feels like a very important question, doesn't it, for everyone? Okay, so just to give an idea of who we usually talk to, we're talking to landlords with 1,000 properties or under, up to large housing associations who have 125,000 properties across the country, and local authorities of varying scales and in different combined authorities, local authorities and different groupings. One of the most successful things we often see is when they take a programmatic approach versus a project approach to retrofit. So what I mean by this is when you kind of reflect within the organisation, are we set up in a way that's going to help us support what we need to do with retrofit? Because hopefully retrofit becomes one thing that we do over the next 20 years, and it's done, it becomes part of our asset management going forward. We build better homes and we invest in our existing ones in a regulated way, which meets a certain standard. So when we see those who are receiving grant funding, it's not that they've started a project based around that grant funding project. They already have an ongoing program of works, and funding comes in as an opportunity alongside that. To put that more into practical terms, I think what they're looking at is, if you take it in, when we talk about operating models, for example, if you're looking to a desired change, are you ready for retrofit? You might consider from a human-machine side, that's one framework to split it. So from the human side, do we have the in-house capabilities to deliver retrofit? Yes, no? Will we have to go out? If we need to go out, what budget are we willing to spend on that externally? Do we need to then change our investment committee percentages that we're happy with spending on external consultancy to deliver projects? From the machine side, we're talking more about, do you have data and your systems that support you to deliver retrofit? So generally, when we're thinking about those successful cases of accessing grant funding, is when it's not project, it's programmatic.
I think there's some really good tips there, like having the in-house capabilities or knowing to bring them in, but also having the right data so you can identify the right homes to be targeting and what works need to happen. Moving on from retrofit finance funding, because I think we know that funding, although absolutely crucial to tackle fuel poverty and to support the social housing sector, is not going to cover all the retrofit we need to do. In fact, most of it will be privately financed or financed via the banks. So I wonder, Ryan, if you could give us a little bit of an overview of what types of retrofit finance are currently available, what's out there in the system?
Yeah, so I could talk for a long time about this because there's very specific products that are out there. But I'll try to group them into a few relevant areas. I'll start by saying that often when I talk, especially with policymakers about this or other local councils, there's very much a tendency to look at the grant side of it, look at the public funding side and hope that pot's going to grow. The CCC has said that we're going to need over £370 billion of investment to retrofit all of our buildings in the UK. And they said that between 65 to 90% of that's going to have to come from the private sector. And when we say the private sector, we don't mean necessarily your big institutional investors. We also mean anyone in this room who has a mortgage. Your mortgage should be, in the future, a green mortgage, where there are incentives to encourage you to also do works to retrofit your property. And so the work we're doing at GFI is trying to make sure that everybody has, as I said earlier, an appropriate financial solution available to them. So if I start with residential and I guess owner-occupiers, and some of it applicable to private rented sector as well, landlords, green mortgages are often held up as one of the more, I guess, success stories of retrofit finance. There were 4, there's now around 90. We've worked with loads of banks to bring them to market, and it's really good. There are things there such as cash back, a couple of £1,000 if you do a piece of work for your property, a lower interest rate if you improve the EPC of your property. But there's still work to do there. We still need more products which are looking more at bringing homes from a G to a C rather than focusing on your A's, your B's, and your C's. So that's kind of the work we're doing in the green mortgage space. On the unsecured loans space, so this is where an individual might take out a product. They've already got a mortgage on the house, or they've paid off the mortgage. They don't want to get another mortgage, but they need £10,000 for a specific piece of kit. We now know there's around 24, 25 of these products on offer in the UK. That's tripled in the last 18 months. And again, we've worked with a lot of the banks to develop and make them feel comfortable as to what those products look like. And that's why we've been really happy that the new government has committed to having some public support behind a low interest loan in the manifesto that they ran on last year. And we're working at the minute to structure what that can look like. So on the consumer finance side, things are happening. On the infrastructure side, I think often when we're talking to some of our stakeholders, they forget that more than 90% of the emissions that we need to get rid of in the built environment come purely from how we heat. And often these discussions, especially in government, end up talking only about heat pumps. I'm increasingly trying to talk about heat, including heat pumps and heat networks. And the government wants to make 20% of heat from all buildings come from heat networks. That's a completely different finance offer that we need to be looking at, which is how do we get large infrastructure investors to invest debt in large infrastructure in our cities where they're going to be heat network zones, but also how do we encourage the kind of investors that are investing in this stuff in Europe to invest in the UK? What's the policy environment to create for that? That's one that's very much a live answer and one that we're working on developing at the minute. If I then quickly jump to social housing and to local authorities, Natalie's absolutely right that it's been very grant-driven to date. And quickly with my Westminster Council hat on, I like to think we have a good operating model where we apply for the grant every year, we've got staff in-house, then we have a voids policy where we retrofit a void when a tenant moves out. But to be able to hit the targets that we need, I need to be able to access a lot more than what the grant pot's going to give me. Just for Westminster alone, I need £5.1 billion in heat network and solar and various other energy developments from our local area energy plan. That's been spat out. And we need about 250 million to retrofit buildings that we own. So there are emerging products to do that. The National Wealth Fund, which GFI, we ran the National Wealth Fund Task Force, we advised government how to set that up. They're now providing guarantees for up to £1.4 billion worth of loans from Lloyds, Barclays, and a couple of other finance providers, I can't remember off the top of my head, sorry if you're in the room, where social housing providers can go to them and take out that bigger loan. It could be a £200 million loan to cover a lot more stock. That would work alongside the grant because the finances don't make sense now purely with the private finance. But there are these emerging things coming out, and we're working to try to educate the providers that you can tap these things, but also government that they can provide more support on this as well. There's a lot more than just that, though, and I'm sure some of the Q&A might bring up some other products later.
Nice. I don't know, Ben, do you want to add anything on what types of people are investing in this space in the commercial sector and how you sort of target who might be able to fund the work that you do?
Yeah, so, I mean, if you look across sort of the capital options that you have in sort of like conventional, traditional commercial real estate, you have to understand that the way in which we invest and operate and own commercial buildings is subject to the appetite of the investor and ultimately the cost of capital, their rate of return. So we would traditionally be involved in projects where there's a much shorter hold period, so either a value add or cool plus strategy, where the annualized rate of return is probably somewhere between sort of, low to mid-teens to potentially into the 20s. That means in terms of the investment that we need to, these are sort of high risk, high return strategies. Whereas at the other end of that spectrum, you've got your pension funds, your sovereign wealth funds, your sort of more, more patient capital, and they're obviously looking for less return. Now, at that end of the spectrum, those investors are ultimately wanting to transact on buildings that meet future energy target commitments set out by the Paris Agreement. They want sustainability credentials. They want high levels of energy performance. We could talk for a long time as to whether or not those rates or standards are actually effective, but it's what we're working with. So effectively, we will work in partnership with an investor to take a building that is distressed, dislocated, is facing obsolescence, and we will invest into it in a tactical and measured way to bring it up to a future performance standard. Obviously, it's be no shock to everyone in the room that because post-pandemic, hybrid working, the way in which we own and operate and interface with commercial real estate has changed, lease lengths are shorter. So we're in this sort of interesting world where actually, if you can't get a 10-year lease anymore, how do you determine as to whether or not you're going to be buying a building that is ultimately going to have financial resilience in the long term and therefore acceptable to a more patient capital basis? The answer to that ultimately becomes things like future energy standards, something called CREM, which is a point at which a building will strand in the future, which ultimately says, well, at that point in time, you're going to have to reinvest into the existing infrastructure within the building, and ultimately that's going to come at a cost. So I would not necessarily say, to answer your question, Rachel, that people are investing into these buildings through the fact that they create more energy efficient outcomes. The outcome of the investment is that actually future investors are looking for financial resilience and stability. The shorthand for that is energy standards. So for us, I think it's about how do you get to that future energy standard? And actually, I think a lot of the industry as well has, talked a very good game around getting net zero, 2050 standards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is a huge level of investment to be able to plow capital into a building and expect it not to have any future investment into it over the next 25 years. Like that's quite a big ask. So a lot of the work that we're doing is we're saying, well, our future buyer is going to be a sovereign wealth fund or otherwise. They are going to want to hold on to that asset to 10 to 15 years. Our objective is to get it through to the next 10 to 15 years. So that actually once that building has stabilized, income producing, that ultimate institutional investor wants to exit it, then actually there will be a second wave of refurbishment that comes afterwards. The technology is going to be better, costs will ultimately be higher, but we're sort of, rather than chasing perfection, we're actually trying to chase a route that I think has been almost forgotten about as we've started to think about the more prestigious projects that have been brought forward, particularly in the capital. We were very good at championing the prime grade A refurbishments that absolutely smash the lights out, but ultimately that is such a small segment of the industry. It's like pretending that we're all going to be driving around in Formula One cars because that's the thing that we're interested in. So I would say that and it's all like I honestly believe this is a good thing, that the de facto measure of future economic resilience has become sustainability and energy performance. But I think we're all trying to fix the same problem using the same strategies and the same numbers. And as I'm sure most people in this room will appreciate, those numbers aren't making things stack up at the moment. So my belief is we do need to try to find another way of doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the parallels between the approach you're advocating for, and actually what we advocate for quite a lot in the domestic sector, which is having a retrofit plan, knowing what your pathway is, but you might not necessarily do it all at once. It depends on what your outcomes you need to achieve right now are and what you can afford to fund. So it's interesting to see those parallels go across sectors. I mentioned that we might move on and talk a little bit more about how we can sort of consider a whole place in this and how we can sort of maybe link up different ways of financing in a place. And I don't know whether Stuart and Natalie, you might like to talk a little bit about what place-based considerations should we make? What aspects of a place do we need to think about when we're thinking about financing this work? What and who do we need to be involved? Who should be in the discussion, really? And do you have any thoughts on how all of that can be coordinated? I know, Stuart, this is probably something you spend quite a lot of your day job doing.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts. Yeah, and Ryan actually teed it up quite nicely when he mentioned the adjacency of retrofit and heat networks. So yeah, when you take that, I'm going to use the word term whole system. I know we've all heard it before, but it's really looking at all three energy vectors: heat, electricity, and transport. And if you take those three as a holistic whole and seek solutions to each of them, you start to then see kind of beneficial solutions and approaches for each come together. And that is really starting to play into the kind of investment and financing environment around it. So a big change we're seeing in the investment space, and I don't know too much about the institutional investment space, but that that kind of patient capital area that Ben touched on, so the pension funds, etc., and the backing they are giving now to energy service companies. The sort of joining up of those with local authorities, a model that's starting to really emerge. Bristol is one of the first test cases. Coventry is another. We're working with a number of others that are looking to procure. Feels like my microphone's changed. Am I getting feedback?
Do you want to try this one instead? Swapsies.
Yeah, and that the backing they've got is from more patient capital. So it is a longer term view on return. There is still a return that's required and necessitated. It is a bit lower, and it's not seeking the capital return first. It's happy to see, a bit of a hurdle overcome, and then it's repaid. So yeah, going back to your question, Rachel. The place-based approach, looking at all the parts of the energy system together, and retrofitting homes as part of that, pulls out the macro scale, the aggregation opportunities, and that is what is really creating the opportunity for aggregation of finance and kind of blended investment models too.
Natalie, do you have... Oh yeah, you're right.
I do.
Go for it. Yeah.
Actually, I'm really glad you teed me up really nicely there as well. Thank you, Stuart. So I guess I can talk a bit more about let's go to a smaller scale, an actual case study that we have here. So I come from a regeneration background. So we're constantly, when we're lining up our portfolio or program of regeneration of 125 assets that we have to think about, what are we going to do with them over the next 30 years? We also start to look at where there are catalytic opportunities. So I've got two examples here. So for a regeneration program, you're getting in your socioeconomic data, you're looking for where there are active resident groups, you're looking at your poor performing, high repair issue estates, and you're kind of lining them all up and layering all that data in a way that allows you to start thinking, where are the opportunities? Do we start with this neighborhood? Does it look like it'd be the best one to do a regen in because it's just going to need to be rebuilt in order to meet housing demand? But the way we would take a place-based strategy for that to then add on retrofit is that we start to see its proximity to other active resident engagement neighborhoods. And we start thinking, do we have good relationships with the local stakeholders, the energy advisory bureaus, the churches, the faith organizations, the local councils? And that allowed us to start to prioritize which neighborhoods we're going to look at in order to deliver a bit of a hybrid retrofit, refurb, regen project. Now, going more towards, let's just go with pure retrofit, we were approached by a client who had an estate of about, let's say, 300 homes. they had funding that was being made available through their combined authority for a net zero neighbourhood plan to be developed. And that was looking at that whole system approach, tackling both heat and heat network opportunities, as well as transportation and improving active mobility and the health of their residents. And then looking at the home itself in terms of electricity and energy for the homes. And so with that state, we couldn't have taken anything but a place-based approach because it was non-traditional, semi-detached, 50% leaseholder, 50% social housing. And each of those, you could almost guess, were attached to each other. So literally pepper-potted, next door, your leaseholder and social housing. So we could not have just gone down the SHDF route or the local grant because the leaseholders weren't going to be eligible for that. Instead, what we managed to do is map out a template for how they could look for different types of funding that would be eligible. And they were able to combine things like, forgive me for this, but it was like the grant funding for it was Regeneration Skills Fund or something like that. Don't know if anyone else knows about that. But it was through regeneration you get funding to increase jobs and skills in the green sector. And there was another fund that was available to them that we found that would enable them to have retrofit assessments done for the private properties. And then we could draw down funding for SHF and combine all of that together to create a decarbonisation plan for the homes, which was fantastic. We also were then able to identify that there was additional funding for increasing active mobility and setting up an initial survey of the residents to understand what their sustainable behaviours were and the barriers to an active lifestyle and using, bikes instead of using cars. So that whole exercise, the point of it was a really complex neighbourhood, but through that we created a methodology for them to assess funding that was available to them, understand what sort of stakeholder engagement they would need with their communities to bring this forward, and what sort of, let's say, best conditions there were in the estate that they could then start to use that methodology to appraise other neighbourhoods. Now, I can't guarantee they've done that, but I've definitely taken that away as a methodology I will be using whenever we work with another organisation who has complex neighbourhoods where they just need to understand, is place-based something that will enable us to make an area-based transition as opposed to just a pepper-potted, non-effective approach to retrofit.
Fantastic. I thought maybe we could all build on that a little bit in terms of, you mentioned sort of how they incorporated different pots of finance and funding to do this work. And this is something we're hearing more about, the idea of like blending or stacking different finance sources, or maybe even leveraging sort of future avoided costs. So I don't know whether or not any of you want to say anything about any experiences you've had with trying some of those strategies and what might those avoided costs be, what types of finance have you found work well together?
I can start, if useful. I do think there's a number of potential opportunities for avoided costs. And I think they can be seen, and I'm drawing on some of the report that was published just recently that Becky, my colleague, was involved in. I really would urge everyone to read. It really does quantify quite specifically what avoided costs look like, how they're measured, and what the potential value of them is. It does focus a lot on the avoided costs of the, our public systems, our public health systems. Natalie touched on NHS, health, education, productivity of the UK workforce, etc., etc. But there's also an avoided cost of the energy system in hard infrastructure as well. I'm sure we've all heard about the gridlock on the gridlock on the electricity network with connections, 10-year queues for connecting to the transmission system, etc. By deploying demand-side response flexibility in the system and even at a micro level in a house, the aggregated impacts of that on the distribution networks and the mitigation of investment of reinforcement, upgrades, new substations, etc. There's a potentially huge amount of avoided costs there. That's ultimately taxpayer bills or energy bills, sorry, that could be reduced through that. But the avoided costs from the reactive nature of dealing with health problems, absenteeism, the whole gamut of societal issues that we've got that come about through poor housing, poor places.
I'll add two bits on avoided cost, then I wanted to talk a bit about stacking. Before I get to the national economic picture that's just been outlined there, one that we've been looking at on avoided costs is avoided maintenance costs going forward for social housing providers. So you will already have, as we do as a council, a business plan looking forward, and you've already started to set aside the amount that you think you're going to have to invest in maintenance costs. But we all know that if we're properly retrofitting our properties, then the amount of mould is going to reduce, the amount of damp's going to reduce. And from me as a councillor's perspective, I'm thinking, well, I'm going to be paying less third-party contractors to go out and do that work now. So is that a potential revenue stream we could capture into the future? And then back with my Green Finance Institute hat on, that is something we're looking at quite actively, where that guarantee I talked about earlier for the National Wealth Fund to social housing lenders, could one of the cash flows coming back from that be, you've already set aside this cash for maintenance, instead, why can't you use it to help repay this loan, which might have a lower interest rate because it's a guarantee for the National Wealth Fund. So I think we need to start to think creatively about this, because many of us know that the economics of retrofit in itself right now doesn't necessarily stack up for most investors. And so we need to be looking at where do these other cash flows come from, which is why I think the national picture is really interesting, because the only stakeholder who can capture the cash flow benefits of avoided investment in the NHS is the UK government. And so if they're looking at this and thinking about, if we put X billion into social housing decarb fund, local grant, supporting a low interest loan, how much are we going to be able to save over here? And then with all the discussions you'll be seeing in the news at the minute about fiscal black hole and fiscal constraints, how can we square those two so it essentially washes its own face? I think that's something that we need to be looking at to think more creatively about this. Just very quickly on your question about stacking. Back to council now. Every single project we're looking at every single funding option available to us. And so if it's going out and speaking to Natalie about which grants I can get to make up the first bit of the source, then it's going to National Wealth Fund for a loan, then it's going to Sadiq and the various funds that they have at London, and then it's our own investment, our own borrowing. We're trying to do all we can to reduce our costs because we think this is a priority to reach net zero as a council. Not every council necessarily has the ability to do that. And so one of the big things that I'm trying to say to the government at the minute is that meeting net zero isn't a statutory duty for a local authority. And so when you've got statutory duties on things like adult social care and education and housing, the amount of time you're going to put into this is going to reduce. And it's not just your own projects, but it's also your role as owner of place and shaping that place. So even heat networks, which are being talked about earlier, I don't plan to invest in a lot of the heat networks we're going to need built in Westminster, but we still have a role with planning, with highways. And if we don't have the time, resource and capability to engage with that, then those wider projects get delayed. So there's a lot more there, I think, to be able to give councils the space to be able to focus on this as well.
Great. Ben, do you want to say anything on that? I'll move on to the next one is for you.
Rachel, can I just add
go ahead.
One point, just on what Ryan's talking about and I touched on earlier. Again, I spent 45 minutes reading the report I just referenced, and it was just this light bulb moment that appeared when they drew the link that what we're lacking is basically the piggy bank. Treasury has got a role to create a piggy bank that can identify, measure, quantify, and pull out those avoided costs, whether it's from reduced maintenance or the electricity network upgrades, whatever it is, and that becomes its own national wealth fund. How are we pooling all these costs that we're currently spending through other mechanisms in a reactive way, bringing that out, measuring it, grabbing it, and putting it into an investable proposition, which huge amount of outcomes.
Yeah, great idea. Ben, you talked a bit about what the mechanisms are and why investors might start to enter this space and what you need to show to them in terms of the planning to make this viable. But I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about what do those sort of people in investment, private finance need to see from you in order to sort of unlock the investments that they make, and what do you kind of need to show them to make it possible, and how does that work?
Yes, I mean, I quite like to joke that actually I'm not really in development, I'm in risk management. Because ultimately, to attract capital, to attract investment, to do any of the things that we do, we essentially need to look after the money of others, and actually whether that's a less patient capital, shall we say. Actually, even the backing of that comes from everyone's pension or otherwise. So, even though we will be perhaps wanting to achieve better rates of return, ultimately everyone should have an interest in that because it's all our money. Now, as a demonstration of how we work, I mean, we are essentially proving or demonstrating that the approach that we have is able to deliver an adequate rate of return, which as I've sort of said, is usually 20%, and over the time horizon of any typical development that we would be working on, which is 3 years, that means that we need to increase asset value by about 75%. Now, the difference between having a 3-year business plan and a 5-year business plan is due to the power of compounding interest. If we need to produce the same rate of return over a 5-year period, we almost have to double that asset value so we're adding 75% of value over a 3-year period, but in 5 years' time, actually that asset value has to be 250% of what it was originally. So what we're doing is demonstrating that our business plans are faster. By virtue of them being faster, they can also be more cost effective. By virtue of being more cost effective, we're actually ensuring that the end value is more affordable and more sustainable in the long term. And then the way in which we do that is almost articulating some of the science behind the work that we do, particularly on the M&E side, to demonstrate that by keeping a lot of the systems that we're already using, actually that delivers a return. So to take that and apply it to a real life example, we're working on a large building in the City of London at the moment. It was built in the late 90s. It isn't what most people would term as heritage, but it's Grade 2 star listed. And what we are doing is fundamentally keeping about 68%, 2/3 of the existing energy infrastructure within that building. That's basically ductwork, copper, cabling, stuff that basically carries energy from a heat source to a terminal unit, which is on floor. For want of a better word, it's just galvanized ductwork that's been in the building since it was built. Now, that takes a lot of work for us to basically validate that system and say that that piece of metal that's been there for 30 years is still a good piece of metal that's going to carry hot or cold air. But the saving that we're able to generate by doing due diligence, technical validation, surveys, or otherwise, is fundamentally about 40% of the overall CapEx investment for the total project. And so, as you just trying to frame this around not necessarily just looking at existing buildings, but looking also at existing systems and how we can use those adequately to ultimately generate a profit to our investors. It's really not that easy because actually to understand these systems, you need a degree, you need an engineering degree to solve them. And I think the challenge that we have at the moment is that whilst we have a lot of investors who are experts in their field, they are not necessarily experts in engineering. And this is very much a new problem that I think we're all facing, particularly post geopolitical crisis and a dramatic increase in construction costs and labour costs post Brexit. But it's fundamentally the environment that we're having to work in at the moment. We try to do all of that quite visually as well. So with lots of slides about things that we're keeping and things we're retaining. But ultimately, I think investors are there there's a huge weight of capital that can be deployed into these things, and they're just waiting for someone to come up with the right answer, with the right risk-adjusted returns, and the right skill set to be able to deliver it.
Also great when the financial argument and the embodied carbon argument align and compound one another. So it's great to hear that as well. Before we move to questions from the audience, I have one more question, maybe for all of you, which is, I'm guessing lots of people in the audience are probably working with, they might not be accessing finance directly themselves, but they might be working with domestic homeowners who are accessing finance. They might be, I don't know, local authorities who find that finance might be a barrier to uptake of retrofit in their area. They might be working with developers who are trying to access finance. So I don't know if you've got any tips for any of those people who are sort of seeing that finance is a barrier to the people that they work with in getting into the retrofit space. How would you, what tips would you give them? And you can target any of those types of people I mentioned. Who wants to go first?
A lot of questions in there.
Yes.
I can jump in very quickly. If I start with domestic homeowners, the biggest blockers, I get asked all the time by banks, by government, how do we drive uptake in our green mortgage, green loan, whatever products we've already got on offer? And it's not necessarily awareness of the products themselves, it's awareness of what they need to do and why they should bother doing it in the first place, and then what finance do I need for it. So there's an education piece still to be had here around why a heat pump isn't the scary thing that certain newspapers might claim it is, or why solar is a good thing to put onto your roof, and why insulation will save you on your energy bills over time. And then once people are aware of what they need to do, they're then going to obviously look for the best finance deal. And in fact, mortgage brokers have a responsibility to tell them what the best product available to them is. So it's not necessarily about the awareness of the finance for that. It's about the awareness of what we need to do more widely. And I think we can all agree on that. Councils as well, it's internal capacity and resources. Many councils don't have the ability to have dedicated staff working on this sort of stuff. I'm very lucky that my administration in Westminster has made a concerted effort to put investment into that, but we might lose the next election and whoever comes in might decide this isn't important anymore and get rid of all the staff, like we have seen in certain councils in the last few months. So this thing is, it's inherently for councils, it's uncertain until we put it on some sort of statutory footing to require them to work on it more specifically. I won't answer every type of stakeholder, to leave some for the rest of the panel.
Yeah, I'll take a different angle on it. So I think there's an element of, let's think about social housing as well as local authorities delivering and increasing the uptake from households that they either own or that are within their area. Trust is a big one. There have been a few schemes in the past that have failed because, especially if it's not an owned asset, but you go with a contractor to a door and say, hey, we can give you a free heat pump, windows, et cetera, there's a lot of skepticism because there's no tracing it back to who that is, and it sounds too good to be true, quite frankly. So there isn't necessarily an easy way to overcome trust, but I think understanding where there might be existing trust issues due to repeat repairs issues. So if you're a landlord and you know, for example, your estate is continuously getting repairs logged and they're not being treated, or perhaps there is antisocial behavior on there that is not being remedied through neighborhood teams, you need to know what you're starting with when you go in with any marketing and raising awareness and increasing desire, because without having the trust between the landlord and the tenant, you're not going to get a foot through the door. And I think that's one of the key ones I tend to work with organisations on.
Either. Both very good points. In the private, the owner-occupied, the mass private sector, it does come down to trust, as Natalie was saying. So it's trust around what is this heat pump? How do you drill through the wall? What am I going to be left with when you've disappeared? But it's also the actual trust of finance world and products. And we've had two failed schemes, national schemes, where homeowners can allegedly go and access finance, secure trusted installers and all the rest of it, and they've fallen over because they're complex and they're not trusted. And then the third bit, which again Ryan has mentioned, is the the kind of link between the mortgage market and what people are doing to their own homes once they've got finance to do stuff is still not there. But it's great to hear Ryan say that those products are really starting to come to market and tripling in 18 months. So yeah, it's a trust thing, but it's technical trust, it's finance trust, it's what does it mean for my mortgage, what does it mean for my insurance. That the whole insurance industry is sort of really quite risk averse as well, and I think quite standoffish at the moment about retrofit, particularly because of the workmanship things that Natalie's mentioned. So yeah, there's a trust thing at every step of the every part of the chain, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be a bit binary about it. It's this. I mean, I think there are fantastic opportunities, and I do think what other people have said around central government, local government, what we should be doing as an industry. But the fundamental question that we are asked is, does it make money? Does it produce a return on investment? Otherwise, if it doesn't, from our perspective, create value, if that value is not worth the capital investment that then goes into these projects, these things just won't happen. I think there is an interesting world that we live in at the moment where you can create value through expertise and debt funding, where you can almost come in and almost like try to save the day for an existing asset owners or otherwise, because they're literally in a world where their asset value's in free fall and they can't sell because they'll crystallize a loss. They can't borrow any money because they're already in default. They know their building is going to be worth something. And so the opportunity there, I think, is always to be able to produce a business plan that will ultimately save them from a problem. But the challenge you will always have is the additional capital investment that you're bringing into that. They need to see a rate of return. So everything is very much underpinned by, is it going to make money? And I think particularly for the private sector, whether that be an individual homeowner or institutional landlord, I think the conversation is the same, and it's unfortunately quite muddy to get to that answer quite quickly.
But I'm glad that you mentioned value as well, because I think the commercial sector is in some ways better at financially valuing things like, does this building make me feel healthier? Does it reduce absenteeism? Does it provide good indoor air quality? Do the people want to work here? That's actually being valued financially. So I think that really links back to Ryan's point about we need to be able to communicate why someone might want to do this, and then that then links back to the trust. So, questions from the room. Please put up your hand if you have questions. All welcome. There are no silly questions. We've got one just here.
I've got one which is about value, really, because I think what we hear from Ben mostly, but that it's pretty thin. And I wonder if there's a role for government in increasing the jeopardy of those assets that are not performing and therefore creating value like that. So the legislation in this country about building performance is pretty weak. I mean, at the domestic scale, the Future Home Standard is kind of a damp squib, and I think probably ultimately that will create big problems for the country. So I wonder if there's a role for legislation in ramping up the pressure and stranding more assets.
Can I start? I think it's a really important point, and also really complex, because we've also got to manage, lots of these homes are owned by private individuals, and we need to think about social justice in making sure that they can afford to do this work, and that they're not then left with a home that they can't sell. I do think that the MEES updates, the minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rental sector, are going to go a long way, but it is going to be absolutely critical where they set the fabric rating. We've just done some modelling, and we're about to release a report tomorrow on what's needed from the design of that regulation, because the risk is that they set the fabric rating too low, and essentially you just need to do a little bit of loft insulation and you're all good. Go get yourself a heat pump. Off we go. 10% of the private rental sector have got a serious health hazard, so then that's not going to be addressed by that standard. So I think those types of regulations is really important, but getting the levels right is really, really key. And then we've got to figure out how to tackle the owner-occupied sector, which is a big challenge. So maybe you've got some ideas, Ryan.
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts. I guess the short answer is yes. The longer answer is there's a lot more nuance, obviously. I mean, MEIS is going to be really important, I think, to be that stick that if you don't do something, here's what's going to happen to you. And the consultation is currently live for social housing MEIS. But then, obviously, government has to think about, well, once we've got that in, how do we actually support them to do it? And that's where the finance still has to be there. So I've been speaking to a couple of banks this week about specifically social housing MEIS and the fact that if you're one of the smaller social housing landlords, the kind of people that you'll be working with, often you only have 5-10% leverage and you don't normally go and tap debt. How are you going to be getting in low-cost finance to retrofit your properties? Or are you just going to end up being exempt? And if you're exempt, then we still don't solve the problem of actually retrofitting these properties. So it's got to be thought about holistically. We can't just say, here's the regulatory stick that's coming for you. We need to think, we're giving you the stick, it's a few years away, and here's how we're also going to support you to find the answer, the carrots to get there. One thing which I'm actually surprised hasn't come up once yet is electricity bills more widely. So when I'm looking at heat pumps, heat networks, and the economic models underpinning an owner-occupier investing in a heat pump or a large developer investing in a heat network, the fact that electricity bills are so much higher than gas bills simply means the economics of many things don't work. And, REMA's been happening for a while. Government is now looking at if there is a better way to fix this into the future. But heat networks are a really good example here where in certain inner city areas, the only way to decarbonise heat for some of our, not even residential buildings here, but in Westminster, I've got to deal with the Houses of Parliament, National Gallery, Somerset House. Those guys are only going to be able to be decarbonised with a heat network. But right now, some of the proposals that are coming across my desk as a councillor, I can't in good faith commit any of my buildings to connect to them because I'm basically saying I'm a cash-strapped councillor and I'm going to increase my energy bill for the next 20 years to try to get this thing built to help the wider city, and I can't do that. So there needs to be a longer discussion on the economics, and that is a government position as well. So yes, they can regulate, but they can also do other things to shift the economics.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that the link of the jeopardy of the value of assets, the institutional investors that Ben is that world he's invested in, and the impacts of climate change on those assets, I think they're very much waking up to that jeopardy. And again, related to the insurance sector, if homes are flooding, overheating, insurance claims are going up, people aren't then taking out insurance, potentially. Defaulting on mortgage if they are having to pay for claims and damage repair. So I think that whole jeopardy of climate change on assets is happening, but whether it's that regulatory level kind of jeopardy link, yeah, that's quite interesting, and I agree.
The point about avoided costs, I think historic England research is that our weather in the winter will get 3 or 4 or 5 degrees warmer and 30% wetter. And if you think about the amount of buildings that actually struggle with current climate, and you just think they're going to be in a really sad state. So that's, I guess, why I think legislation has a role that it's not taking.
I read about this model in Germany, an insurance model where they are reducing both the size, your insurance premium, but also the excess if you have retrofitted for climate change impacts. So literally water sealing doors and windows and things like that, so you're not flooding. So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about, I think.
Any other questions from the room? Yeah, Alex.
Hi. I feel like it would be remiss not to talk about VAT being the money retrofit meet. And I wondered whether the panel could perhaps, I'm not an expert on VAT, but I wondered whether, if the government abolishes VAT on retrofit, whether that could really turbocharge that return on investment. Does that shift the playing field in terms of the finances and how it stacks up?
what does it do to your modelling, Ben?
Yeah. So I think actually both questions on this are actually, I think there is a clear line of delineation between the commercial sector, where ultimately real estate is a commodity, versus the domestic scene where real estate is people's home. And as a commercial investor in retrofit, VAT isn't a problem because it's recoverable. Yes, it's a cash drag, but ultimately the ways in which we can engineer those systems, like that is not the issue within these projects. Where it does obviously become an issue is to your homeowners, your small landlords. I mean, some of these will obviously have companies associated with them, but it's just bonkers that anyone else who's trying to adopt these schemes, do a good thing, is just going to get a 20% premium on top of it just because it's perceived as being, I don't even know like why it even exists. It's just nuts. Given that you can do all of these things, you can go down to Dewson's, buy some 4x2, and if it's for a new build, be 20% cheaper. Whereas if it's for a refurbishment, there's a 20% levy on it. So it's utterly bonkers. I think the way, obviously, in which I think in this country we're very good at sticks and not very good at carrots. So the way in which that balance needs to be readdressed is quite complicated. But I do think when you move beyond the world in which I'm typically operating, VAT is a real problem. And I suspect, actually, whilst I think it would be a really good thing to do and an absolutely necessary thing to do, unfortunately, I think it's probably come a bit too late because construction costs are now more than 20% higher than they were 18 months ago. So it's almost, I don't think it will necessarily have the desired solution, but others might think differently.
No, I disappointingly was going to say I don't think I can really speak on this topic, unfortunately.
I guess it's complicated as well. And I'm glad that you said that, Ben, because I've been wondering about that since starting to work at a small non-profit and managing our cash flow. I was like, oh, the VAT, it just all cancels itself out. So as long as you have a business and you're paying VAT, essentially it all cancels out at the end of the day. So it's only really affecting private households. I think it's important when we're thinking about keeping buildings versus demolishing buildings. One of my first projects I started as a part one was a big extension and refurbishment. I came back as a part two and it was turned into a new build because it was actually cheaper because they saved so much money on VAT. That's a big issue. Where do I think that we should be reducing VAT on someone that's paying 40k for a new kitchen? Not sure. So I think it's maybe about there are certain things that are rated a small amount of VAT. Maybe we should expand the scope of that. So if you're replacing single glazing with double glazing, I think you can get that at a lower rate of VAT. But if you're replacing crap double glazing with double glazing that actually works and isn't all blown, then you can't get a VAT exemption for that. So I think that there's space in the system for change that maybe wouldn't cost the Treasury so much money.
That's actually interesting. I think what we've been talking about has been the Treasury question here around VAT, but actually you just mentioned an example of a project here, and that is pretty much what I spent my life doing, which is writing investment committee papers where you stack up everything, you say, here are our metrics that are acceptable in terms of what we can spend, what's our return on investment, how long is it going to take to pay back, et cetera, et cetera. And it always used to strike me as so weird when I first started that we're buying the same bricks, as you just said, for a private development that was next door to us as we are for the social housing development. And so as we started to realise that our regeneration projects, as well as our refurb and retrofit hybrid options, weren't competitive with obviously the new build, we knew that, but they still needed a cultural change, that organisational, operational change I was saying earlier about. We needed to start socialising that these were going to be more expensive upfront in this way, but we would have these avoided costs later. And one of the things I didn't get to say about earlier was about hacked wellbeing value. That was actually something that we built into our IC, our investment committee reports. And we'd say, when we were looking at different options, how much wellbeing could we generate through the improvement of this place through refurb, deeper retrofit and regeneration?
Thanks. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Laura, I don't know if you've got the mic. I'm happy for you to choose, Laura.
Oh, goodness, the pressure. This gentleman is nearest to me.
Actually, should we do two at once? So maybe this gentleman and then the one that's on the same row as you, and then the gentleman in front as well. All three at once.
Short questions.
Okay. What software tools are you using to model these problems and solutions?
We'll go to this question, and then you can choose what question you answer.
This is going to be quite a change of tack, but what's the panel's thoughts on reducing support for single measure retrofit solutions in the able to pay space and addressing more holistic approach, such as is outlined in PAS 2035 whole house retrofit plans? I think that's a better approach personally. Cut the buzz funding and invest in whole house retrofit plans for everybody.
Thank you. And then we've got one more just in front.
Hi there. We've just finished a course on being a retrofit advisor with a retrofit academy. And so we've got a very basic, brief outline of what the industry is, where it's at. We've got varied backgrounds, obviously. I did land surveying sort of a long time ago, and I was wondering, is there much research on the cost benefits of actually demolition, actually getting rid of it and putting passive housing, sort of, prefabricated SIP housing? It can be social, it can be commercial, it can be housing, as a faster response to what's happening with climate change at the moment. Because the way I'm seeing it, the way I've lived in the south of Spain since 2006, so I've also been living right next to the, basically where 20% of your fruit and veg comes from. I don't see that coming through in the next couple of years. Another side question could be, could new build housing or retrofit include some kind of way of short change kind of food production within the local community? Because I don't see the industrial food industry surviving too long in the future. So sorry to be so
four
negative,
questions to choose from. So you've got, which software do you use? You've got, should we be switching more from single measures towards a more holistic approach? Should we be thinking about should we be thinking about new builders as a solution instead? And what other things can we incorporate within retrofit that we should be considering? So take your pick. I'll go.
Should we each answer all three?
No, there's no time. You have to pick one.
Modelling. Okay, one-click LCA, usually, because we take a materials approach as well to look at things. You want to consider embodied carbon. We can't forget that. We have not talked about it, but embodied carbon is going to be key. And we actually created our own model as well to play around with so that we can look at all different varieties of options.
Yeah, well, definitely agree with the PAS 2035 thing, so that's an easy one. Modelling, yeah, we use it's called Calliope. It's an open source kind of Python-based thing that models millions of scenarios, iterations over a temporal period to get you a cost and carbon benefit. Yeah, the most interesting one I think is the food one, but it's all wrapped up in a place-based. Can we start to create other benefits by regeneration of places? And I think ultimately that question between demolition or rebuild, it can be a marginal cost thing. I think the big question is around the embodied carbon, and I think that's really where Selfridges or Marks and Spencer's on Oxford Street, that's M&S, yeah. So that's where that kind of really hinged on.
I'm going to answer a couple of them as well. In terms of software, we use good old-fashioned the EPC register that's published by the government and 20 years of experience, which if you actually want to do a health check on an existing building, read an air conditioning report. That's really boring. I am less of a whole systems approach, and I'm very much around the low-hanging fruit. So I'm actually looking at technology solutions, and air source heat pumps, mechanical ventilation, and heat recovery, and some sort of form of storage, rather than deep retrofit. Call me a non-believer, but I think it's our fastest route to success. And I think that personally, I mean, we were looking at this the other day, is new build the solution? I think ultimately is going to be part of the solution, so long as you can find a place where it stacks up economically. we were anecdotally looking at a residential scheme in Zone 4, so Greater London. Build costs, no way. But the current build costs being as they are today, there's just no way that you can develop a scheme on that site. So almost I'm saying like retrofit is no longer the alternative. It's like, it's a business strategy.
I'm going to agree with Ben on a couple of points there. I'm very much, I think increasingly we're moving away from the fabric first argument anyway. There's nuance to the bus point, though, which I will come to. So in the council, we currently do go into our void to do a deep retrofit and spend the 35, 40k to really kit it out and massively reduce bills. If there is an option for me to not reduce bills by, I don't know, 50%, but I can reduce it by 20% for more residents, that is a good thing to be able to do. And that's very much how I'm thinking about it. So there are certain social housing solutions out there, green finance solutions, which will involve solar, a heat pump and a battery on 500 properties. And that will reduce those people's bills by X%. And it doesn't preclude you from going back later and doing the insulation. So it is very much a low-hanging fruit point. And if there is willingness of anyone, an individual, a tenant, an owner-occupier, to install a measure today, and that's their way into doing more, I think that's a good thing. I do think that the way bus is currently structured is slightly problematic, though, in that it's 7.5k a pop for whoever has the time to be able to apply for this, and only for heat pumps. And there is a consultation that's just closed about whether it should be expanded. I'm not saying it should be able to be used for heat network connection charges, but the example I always use is, if I lived in a heat network zone and I wanted to get a heat pump, right now I could get 7.5k from bus, and I could get a 5k loan from Santander. I couldn't get anything for a 12.5k connection charge to a heat network. So even though I live in a zone and the logical thing for me is to connect to a heat network, if I don't have 12.5k in savings, I can't do it. So that isn't just an answer for bus being expanded, it's also working with the banks to provide those sorts of loans. But I think going too specific with these sorts of pots is a problem. And finally, I'm not going to solve the industrial food sector here, but in Westminster, hopefully some of you are aware, we brought out what I would say is the most robust retrofit first planning policy in the country, which took several years to develop. Involved a 400-page consultation response from the Westminster Property Association, who are key partners of ours, and it was a very helpful feedback. But I think we developed something very robust, which is a series of tests such that if someone wants to bring demolition, if the M&S came now to Westminster, they would have to have proven that they've met each of those tests before they can demolish. And that involves embodied carbon, it involves costs and the trade-offs. But I think, and many of you in here who work in the industry will know, that sometimes retrofitting, keeping the internal energy systems, as Ben was talking about, can result in a better and cheaper solution if you go about it in the right way. So we try to develop policy that makes people think along those lines. I think that's going to increasingly become policy in various other places as well.
And I think we're seeing a general shift, both in the industry and when we talk to policymakers, away from a sort of prescriptive measures-led approach towards an outcomes-led approach. And I think that's where we really want to get to in the debate, being really clear about what we're trying to achieve, for whom and why, and then that being the thing that influences what we do and how we finance it. Laura's going to give us a little bit of a plug for future sessions, but before we do that, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to our panelists. They might hang around for a little bit if you want to grab them for more questions, but yeah, please do join me in thanking them all.
And thank you, of course, to you, Rachel, for chairing. So for those who don't know me, I'm Laura from the Building Centre. As Rachel said, time to talk. There's the exhibition upstairs, so if you haven't seen Retrofit 25, have a look around. This is our final event for the summer season, but we're back in September. So just to plug the ethics event on the 10th of September, that's going to be chaired by Rachel's co-director, Sarah. And then the 17th of September, we've got our final in-person event, which is on the topic of whole value. So that energy efficiency, but the well-being and health piece with it. And my director, John, will be chairing that. And we're going to have drinks at that event. So please come, bring your colleagues, bring your clients. Yeah. No, sorry, there's no drinks here, but we're going on a trip to look at public toilets in Westminster, aren't we? So, and then The whole retrofit season closes on the 19th of September, but the good news from ourselves as the Building Centre and National Retrofit Hub is we are taking the Retrofit 25 exhibition on the road, and it will be on display in some way, shape or form at Elemental London in November at Excel. So we want to keep all these conversations going. So thank you to everyone today, and thank you. I would encourage the last bit of chat upstairs, though, because it is a bit hot in here now, and our speakers might want to move. So go up to the exhibition. Thanks, everyone.